They thought I would cry. They thought I would beg. 37 years of being the invisible daughter, overlooked at every dinner, erased from every achievement, treated like a guest in my own family. And they expected me to crumble when my father stood up at Christmas dinner and handed my CEO position to my younger sister. The whole room erupted in applause. My mother wiped away her fake tears. My sister Megan performed her rehearsed look of shocked gratitude. Relatives who had ignored me for decades clapped like they were watching a coronation. And I just sat there, in my corner seat, smiling. Not a broken smile, not a defeated smile, the kind of smile that makes people stop clapping. My father noticed first. His champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. "Lindsay, don't you have anything to say?" I looked at him, the man who had treated me like a stranger my entire life, and I said 5 words that would destroy everything he had built. "Dad, don't you know?" The room went silent. Megan's face turned white. She didn't know why she was afraid, but something in my voice told her she should be. "No. What?" she screamed. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent 15 years preparing for this exact moment. The company they thought they controlled, I owned it. The secrets they thought were buried, I had found them all. The family that had erased me from their history, I was about to erase them from mine. This is the story of how I smiled through my own betrayal, because I knew exactly how it would end. My name is Lindsay Walsh. I'm 37 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've worked at my family's company, Walsh Industries, in every role no one else wanted. I've saved failing projects, rescued impossible deals, and built strategies that kept the company alive through 2 recessions. But if you asked anyone in my family what I do, they would probably say, "Lindsay. Oh, she works somewhere in the building." This is the story of how I stopped being invisible. The Walsh family Christmas dinner was always held in the main dining room of my parents' mansion, a space designed to impress rather than comfort. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed impossibly high. The table could seat 24, and every year it was filled with relatives who arrived in expensive cars and left with expensive opinions about everyone else's lives. The decorations were tasteful, the catering was flawless, and the warmth was entirely artificial. I arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, as I had every Christmas for as long as I could remember. No one greeted me at the door. No one took my coat. I hung it myself in the closet near the entrance, the same closet where my coat had hung alone for years, while everyone else's were handled by hired staff. When I entered the dining room, the table was already nearly full. My younger sister Megan sat at my father's right hand, laughing at something he had said. My mother sat at his left, her posture perfect, her smile practiced. Aunts, uncles, cousins, they filled the chairs in the center of the table, clustered together like they were protecting something valuable. My chair was at the corner, not quite at the table, not quite away from it, close enough to be counted in photographs, far enough to be forgotten in conversations. I sat down without a word. No one acknowledged my arrival. An aunt glanced at me briefly, the way you might notice a waiter refilling water glasses. My mother's eyes passed over me without stopping. My father didn't look up at all. This was normal. This had always been normal. I unfolded my napkin and placed it on my lap, while Megan described her recent vacation to Italy, a trip paid for by the company presented as a business development opportunity. Everyone listened with fascination. When I had closed a deal worth $12 million 3 months ago, the only acknowledgement I received was an email from accounting confirming my commission had been processed. Dinner proceeded as it always did. Courses arrived and disappeared. Conversations flowed around me like water around a stone. My cousin asked Megan about her plans for the new year. My uncle congratulated my father on the company's latest quarterly results, driven largely by a restructuring plan I had designed but presented under someone else's name. My mother complimented Megan's dress, her hair, her choice of lipstick. No one asked me a single question. I ate slowly, watching everything, saying nothing. I had learned long ago that silence was safer than speech in this family. Words could be twisted, intentions could be misread, and anything I said would eventually be used as evidence that I was difficult, ungrateful, or simply not as charming as my sister. So I stayed quiet and I watched and I waited. I didn't know I was waiting for something specific until my father stood up. Richard Walsh was 71 years old, but he carried himself like a man who had never been challenged. He tapped his wine glass with a knife, and the room fell silent immediately. Even the staff stopped moving. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades. "As many of you know, I've been thinking about the future of Walsh Industries, about succession, about legacy." My heart did not race. My hands did not tremble. I had stopped hoping for recognition from this man years ago. "After careful consideration," my father continued, "I have decided to name the next CEO of Walsh Industries." He paused for effect. He always paused for effect. "Megan." The room exploded. Not literally, of course, but the applause, the gasps of delight, the chorus of congratulations created a wall of sound that pressed against me from all sides. My mother burst into tears that looked rehearsed even from across the table. Relatives who had barely spoken to Megan all evening suddenly surrounded her with hugs and handshakes. My uncle raised his glass in a toast. And Megan, my sister, who had never stayed past 6 o'clock on a difficult project, who had presented my strategies as her own ideas in dozens of board meetings, who had built her entire reputation on work she had never actually done. Megan pressed her hand to her chest and performed the most convincing display of shocked humility I had ever witnessed. "Dad, I don't know what to say," she breathed. "This is such an honor. I promise I won't let you down." Everyone applauded again. The sound was deafening. I sat perfectly still. For a moment, just a moment, I felt the old wound open. The familiar ache of being overlooked, undervalued, erased. 15 years of work dismissed in a single sentence. A lifetime of trying to earn love from people who had decided I was worthless before I could even speak. But then the moment passed, and something else took its place. I smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a broken smile, a genuine smile, the kind that comes from knowing something no one else knows. My father noticed first. His triumphant expression flickered just slightly as he looked at me across the table. "Lindsay," he said, his tone carrying a warning I had heard 1,000 times. "Don't you have anything to say to your sister?" The room quieted. Everyone turned to look at me. The afterthought, the disappointment, the daughter who never quite measured up. They expected tears. They expected anger. They expected me to finally crack under the weight of one rejection too many. Instead, I looked directly at my father. I held his gaze without blinking. "Dad," I said softly, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "don't you know?" The words hung in the air like smoke. My father's face changed. I watched confusion replace confidence, watched something cold settle behind his eyes. "Know what?" he demanded. I didn't answer. I simply continued to smile, calm, patient, unhurried. Megan's celebration had frozen on her face. She stared at me with an expression I had never seen before, fear. She didn't know why she was afraid. She didn't know what I meant. But something in my voice, something in my stillness told her that the crown she had just received was not what she thought it was. "No, what?" Megan's voice cracked, rising to something close to a scream. I set my napkin on the table and rose from my chair, the corner chair, the forgotten chair, the chair that had held me in place for 37 years. "You'll find out soon enough," I said, and I walked out of that dining room without looking back. Behind me, I heard chaos beginning, voices demanding explanations, Megan crying, my father shouting orders that no one knew how to follow. But I just kept walking, because in that moment, Megan finally understood something she should have realized years ago. The crown she had just received might already be burning, and the sister she had dismissed her entire life was the one holding the match. I drove home that night in complete silence. No radio, no phone calls, no distractions, just the sound of my own breathing and the memories I had spent years trying to bury. People always ask me when I first realized my family saw me differently. The truth is, I cannot remember a time when I did not know. The knowledge was always there, woven into the fabric of my childhood, like a thread so dark it was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. My earliest clear memory of being excluded was my 7th birthday. I remember it precisely because it was the first time I understood that the difference between Megan and me was not accidental. My party was held in the backyard, a small gathering with a few classmates and a homemade cake. Megan's birthday 3 months earlier had been a professionally catered event with a pony, a bounce house, and 40 guests. When I asked my mother why my party was smaller, she looked at me with an expression I would come to know well. Irritation masked as patience. "Megan is more social," she said. "You prefer quiet things. We're giving you what you want." I was 7 years old. No one had asked me what I wanted. The pattern continued through every year of my childhood. Christmas mornings where Megan's pile of presents reached her waist while mine barely covered the floor beneath the tree. Family dinners where my chair was sometimes genuinely forgotten, not moved to the corner but simply not set at all. I would stand in the doorway while my mother sighed and told someone to squeeze in another place setting as though my presence was an inconvenience rather than an expectation. Report cards were the clearest measure of the difference between us. Megan brought home B's and C's, and my parents celebrated her effort, her improvement, her potential. I brought home straight A's, and my father would glance at the paper and set it aside without comment. Once, when I made the honor roll for the 6th consecutive semester, I overheard my mother talking to my aunt in the kitchen. "Lindsay's grades are fine," she said, "but she doesn't have Megan's personality. Intelligence isn't everything. Megan will go further because people actually like her." I was 14 years old, standing just outside the doorway, learning that excellence was worthless if it came from the wrong daughter. The comparisons were constant, and they were never subtle. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became the background music of my adolescence. Why couldn't I smile more, talk more charm, more? Why did I always have to be so serious, so focused, so intense? Megan floated through life on a cloud of approval while I fought for every inch of ground, and somehow I was the one who was doing it wrong. But here is what my family never understood. Their rejection did not break me. It built me. Every time they dismissed my achievements, I learned to achieve for myself. Every time they ignored my presence, I learned to observe without being observed. Every time they told me I was less than Megan, I learned to become more quietly, invisibly, completely. By the time I graduated from college at 22, I had job offers from 3 major consulting firms. I turned them all down to work at Walsh Industries. My father assigned me to the Operations Recovery Division, the department where failing projects went to die. It was the most difficult, most thankless position in the company. I'm certain he expected me to fail. Instead, I thrived. Within 2 years, I had turned around 11 projects that were considered unsalvageable. I restructured supply chains, renegotiated vendor contracts, and identified inefficiencies that had been bleeding money for decades. The company's profit margin increased by 12%, and internal rumors began circulating about the ghost in operations recovery, who could fix anything. But my name never appeared on any report. Every success I created was presented under Megan's name. She had been given a position in strategic development, a department with impressive titles and minimal responsibilities. When I saved a manufacturing partnership worth $8 million, Megan presented the results to the board. When I designed a cost reduction strategy that eliminated waste across 6 departments, Megan took credit in the quarterly shareholder letter. When I spent 3 months salvaging a disastrous acquisition that should have bankrupted us, Megan received a bonus for exceptional leadership. I watched my strategies explained in board meetings by people who did not understand them. I watched my solutions praised when they came from mouths that were not mine. I watched my sister build a reputation on a foundation made entirely of my invisible labor, and I documented everything. Every email I sent, every report I wrote, every meeting I attended, I kept copies. Digital backups, physical files, timestamps, and signatures. I did not know exactly why I was doing it. Some instinct perhaps that told me the truth would matter someday. The moment I stopped hoping for recognition came 3 years ago at the annual shareholder meeting. I had spent 18 months leading a project to expand our international distribution network, the largest initiative in the company's history. I had personally negotiated with partners in 6 countries, resolved regulatory obstacles that our legal team had declared impossible, and delivered results that exceeded projections by 40%. When the presentation began, I was seated in the back row, not on stage, not at the executive table, not even in the reserved section for senior management. I sat with the junior analysts watching as Megan walked to the podium and described my work as though she had done it herself. The shareholders gave her a standing ovation. I sat completely still, my hands folded in my lap, my face revealing nothing. But inside, something fundamental shifted. I understood with perfect clarity that I was not simply being overlooked. I was being erased. My family was not just stealing my future, they were rewriting my past, creating a version of history where I had never contributed anything of value. That was the day I stopped hoping. That was the day I started planning. They thought they had deleted me from the story. They had no idea I had been writing my own version all along. The planning began slowly, carefully, the way you build a house that needs to survive a hurricane. I knew I could not simply confront my family with evidence of their betrayal. Confrontation would give them the opportunity to defend themselves, to twist the narrative, to paint me as the bitter daughter who could not accept her sister's success. I needed something more permanent than accusations. I needed control. 5 years ago, Walsh Industries was drowning. A series of bad investments combined with an economic downturn that hit our sector particularly hard had pushed the company to the edge of bankruptcy. My father refused to acknowledge the severity of the situation publicly, but internally, panic was spreading through every department. Executives were updating their resumes. Vendors were demanding payment in advance. The board was meeting weekly instead of quarterly. I saw opportunity where others saw disaster. My plan was complex but legally sound. I would purchase shares through an intermediary holding company, acquiring enough ownership to eventually take control without anyone knowing I was behind it. To execute this strategy, I needed access to documents that were not available through normal channels: shareholder agreements, transfer provisions, historical ownership records. The family lawyer, a man named Edward Chen, who had served my father for 30 years, was the only person who could help me access these files. What most people did not know about Edward was that he had watched my career with quiet attention. He had seen my work attributed to others. He had witnessed the systematic erasure of my contributions. When I approached him with my proposal, he did not ask many questions. He simply looked at me for a long moment and said, "I've been wondering when you would finally do something about this." Edward gave me access to my father's private office, safe under the pretense of retrieving documents for a routine legal review. I went at midnight, when the building was empty, when there was no risk of being discovered. The safe was hidden behind a portrait of my grandfather, the founder of Walsh Industries, a man who had died before I was born, but whose legacy my father invoked constantly. I found the shareholder documents I needed within minutes, but as I was photographing them, my flashlight caught the edge of something else. A manila envelope yellowed with age, tucked behind a stack of old contracts. The envelope was sealed with tape that had dried and cracked over the decades. Written on the front in my father's handwriting was a date 30 years ago, the year I turned 7. I should have ignored it. I should have taken what I came for and left. But something about that envelope pulled at me, the same instinct that had told me to document everything, to trust nothing, to always look for the truth beneath the surface. I opened it carefully, preserving the seal as much as possible so I could reseal it later. Inside was a single sheet of paper from a medical laboratory, a DNA paternity test. 2 names were listed, Richard Walsh and Lindsay Walsh. The results were printed in clinical emotionless language, but their meaning was unmistakable. Richard Walsh was not my biological father. The probability of paternity was listed as 0%. There was no ambiguity, no margin of error, no room for interpretation. The man who had raised me, who had given me his name, who had looked at me with cold disappointment for 37 years, he had known since I was 7 years old that I was not his daughter. I sat on the floor of that office for a long time, holding the paper in my hands, reading the words over and over as if they might change. They never did. And slowly, like puzzle pieces finally falling into place, everything began to make sense. The distance, the coldness, the way he looked at me, not with the frustration of a father disappointed in his child, but with the resentment of a man reminded daily of a betrayal he could never forgive. I was not rejected because I was inadequate. I was rejected because I was evidence. Every time Richard looked at me, he saw proof that my mother had been with another man before their marriage. I was the price he paid for marrying into her family's money and connections. And he had made sure I paid for it too every single day of my life. My mother knew. She had to know. And she had let it happen. She had watched her husband punish her daughter for a sin that was not the child's to bear, and she had done nothing. She had compensated by pouring all of her affection into Megan, the legitimate daughter, the real Walsh, the one who deserved love. I understood now why no amount of achievement had ever been enough. I could have cured cancer, and my father would have found a way to credit Megan. I was never competing for his approval. I was fighting a battle that had been lost before I was old enough to understand it existed. The realization should have destroyed me. It should have sent me spiraling into grief, into rage, into the kind of emotional collapse my family had always expected from me. Instead, I laughed. It started as a small sound barely audible in the empty office, but it grew until I was sitting on the floor at midnight, laughing at the absurdity of 37 years spent trying to earn love from a man who was biologically and emotionally incapable of giving it to me. I had been running a race with no finish line, climbing a ladder with no top, pouring water into a bucket with no bottom. And now I was free. I owed this family nothing. Not loyalty, not gratitude, not the moral hesitation that had slowed my planning for years. Richard Walsh was not my father. Margaret Walsh had sacrificed me to protect her marriage. Megan Walsh had built her entire identity on my stolen labor. They were not my family. They were obstacles. I photographed the DNA results carefully from multiple angles, ensuring every word was legible. Then I returned the document to its envelope, resealed it as best I could, and placed it exactly where I had found it. I took the shareholder documents I had originally come for, locked the safe, and walked out of that office into the cold night air. For the first time in my life, my mind was completely clear. They had treated me like an outsider because I was one, and now I would make them pay like one. The discovery of that DNA test changed everything about how I saw my past. But what happened next would change everything about my future. Because the truth is, my plan did not begin 5 years ago in that office at midnight. It began 10 years earlier with a phone call I never expected to receive. I was 22 years old, fresh out of college, 1 week into my new position at Walsh Industries. I had already been assigned to Operations Recovery, the department graveyard, and I was beginning to understand that my father intended for me to fail quietly and disappear. That was when my mother called me on a phone number I did not recognize. "Meet me tomorrow," she said. "Alone. Tell no one." She gave me an address for a small cafe in a town 40 minutes outside the city, far from anywhere our family was known. I spent the entire night wondering if this was some kind of test, some new form of manipulation I had not yet learned to recognize. But curiosity won. I drove to that cafe the next morning and found my mother sitting in a corner booth, wearing sunglasses and a scarf like a woman who did not want to be seen. What she told me that day rearranged everything I thought I understood about my family. "Your father will never give you anything," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He has made that decision, and nothing you do will change it. But I can give you something he cannot take away." She explained that when she married Richard Walsh, her family had contributed significantly to the company's early growth. As part of the marriage arrangement, she had received 25% of Walsh Industries shares, her dowry held in her name alone, completely separate from any marital assets. Richard had always resented this arrangement, but he had needed her family's money too badly to refuse it. "I am going to transfer 20% of my shares to you," my mother said, "through a holding company that cannot be traced back to either of us. I will keep 5% to avoid suspicion. Your father monitors the shareholder registry, but he has never paid attention to the smaller institutional holders. You will be invisible." I stared at her, unable to speak. This was the same woman who had watched me be overlooked for 2 decades, who had poured her affection into Megan while treating me like an afterthought. I did not understand why she was doing this. "Why now?" I finally asked. "Why help me after all these years?" My mother removed her sunglasses, and for the first time I saw something in her eyes that looked like grief. "Because I know what he is," she said quietly. and I know what he has done to you. I cannot undo the past, Lindsay, but I can give you a future he cannot control." She did not explain further, and I did not push. Years later, I would understand the full truth of what she meant. But that day, I simply accepted what she offered. The transfer was completed within a month through lawyers my mother had retained independently, professionals who had no connection to Richard or his network. By the time I turned 23, I owned 20% of Walsh Industries without a single person in my family knowing. And then I began to build. For the next decade, I lived two lives. In one life, I was the overlooked daughter working impossible hours in the least glamorous department, watching my achievements credited to others, accepting my role as the invisible engine that kept the company running. In the other life, I was an investor, a strategist, a patient predator waiting for the right moment to strike. I saved aggressively, living far below my means while my salary grew. I invested carefully, building a portfolio that generated returns I could funnel back into my primary objective. And I began approaching minor shareholders, retired executives, distant relatives of early investors, small institutional holders who had inherited shares they did not particularly want. I offered fair prices, always slightly above market value, and I asked only for discretion. Most were happy to sell. None of them knew who was really buying. By the time the company crisis hit 5 years ago, I had accumulated 35% ownership. I was close to a controlling stake, but not quite there. I needed one more push. The crisis provided exactly what I needed. Share prices collapsed by 60% as news of the company's financial troubles became public. Investors panicked. The board panicked. My father scrambled to secure emergency loans and reassure stakeholders that everything was under control. I moved quickly and quietly. Through my intermediary holding company, I purchased an additional 25% of shares at prices that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Sellers were desperate, and I was the only buyer willing to take the risk. By the time the dust settled, I owned 60% of Walsh Industries. Controlling majority. Complete authority over every major decision, every executive appointment, every strategic direction. All done legally. All done silently. All done while my father continued to treat me like a disappointment barely worth acknowledging. The family lawyer, Edward Chen, had been essential to making this work. I had approached him 8 years into my accumulation, when I owned 30%, and could see the path to majority control clearly. I did not try to bribe him or threaten him. I simply showed him the evidence. Years of documented contributions credited to others, strategies I had designed, presented under Megan's name, a pattern of systematic erasure that anyone with eyes could see. "I am going to own this company," I told him. "The only question is whether you want to be on the right side when it happens." Edward was a practical man. He had watched Richard Walsh operate for 30 years, had seen the casual cruelty, the petty vindictiveness, the way he treated anyone he considered beneath him. He looked at my documentation, reviewed my ownership trajectory, and made his choice. "I serve the company," he said, "and soon you will be the company." He helped me structure every subsequent acquisition to be legally unassailable. He ensured that my holding company was properly registered, that all transfers were documented, that there was no angle from which my ownership could be challenged. When I finally revealed myself, there would be nothing Richard could do. By the time my father stood up at that Christmas dinner and announced Megan as CEO, his company had already belonged to me for 3 years. He just did not know it yet. I watched Megan's first week as CEO from a quiet office across town. I had rented the space 6 months earlier under the name of my holding company, a modest suite with good internet and a view of nothing in particular. It was the kind of place no one would think to look for Lindsay Walsh, which was exactly the point. From there, I monitored everything: email reports from contacts inside the company, financial dashboards I had access to, as majority shareholder news alerts set to capture any mention of Walsh Industries. I did not need to be in the building to control what happened inside it. Megan's coronation had been triumphant. The press release announcing her appointment used words like visionary leadership and new era of growth. Her photograph appeared in 3 business publications, always with the same practiced smile, the same carefully worded quotes about honoring her father's legacy, while bringing fresh perspectives to the company. She gave an interview where she described her management philosophy as collaborative innovation. I recognized the phrase. I had written it in a strategy memo 4 years earlier. Her first day in the CEO office, Megan redecorated. New furniture, new artwork, a complete redesign that cost the company $40,000. She hosted a champagne reception for senior executives and spoke about her excitement for the future. Everyone applauded. Everyone congratulated her. No one mentioned that the quarterly revenue projections I had prepared showed a 12% shortfall that needed immediate attention. By her third day, things began to change. It started with the contracts. 3 of our largest partners companies that had worked with Walsh Industries for over 20 years suddenly requested reviews of their existing agreements. Routine renewals that should have been signed within days were delayed indefinitely. Megan's calls to the partner executives went unreturned, or when they were returned, the conversations were vague and non-committal. She did not understand why relationships that had seemed solid for decades were suddenly uncertain. I understood. I had reached out to those partners months earlier through intermediaries suggesting that major changes at Walsh Industries might be coming and that it would be wise to wait before making long-term commitments. I never threatened, never demanded anything. I simply planted seeds of doubt and let them grow. By the end of the first week, cash flow had slowed to a fraction of its normal rate. Payments that should have arrived were delayed. Invoices that should have been processed sat in queues that seemed to grow longer every day. The finance department blamed processing delays. The operations team blamed system migrations. Everyone blamed someone else, and no one could identify the actual source of the problem. The source, of course, was me. As majority shareholder, I had the authority to instruct the restructuring of operational accounts. I had done so quietly through Edward Chen, moving funds into holding patterns that were technically legal but practically paralyzing. The company had money, it simply could not access that money quickly enough to maintain normal operations. It was like watching someone try to breathe through a straw. They could survive, but just barely, and not for long. Megan called Richard in panic on day 8. I know this because Edward told me maintaining his role as the family's trusted lawyer while reporting everything of importance to me. Richard stormed into the office demanding explanations, but the department heads he had controlled for decades suddenly had no answers. It showed him migration timelines that explained nothing. Finance showed him processing reports that meant nothing. The systems were working exactly as designed. They were simply designed to work against him now. Richard tried to call Edward, but Edward was unavailable. In meetings, out of the office, traveling for a family emergency. The excuses varied, but the result was the same. The man Richard had relied on for 30 years was nowhere to be found when he needed him most. Old partners who had always taken Richard's calls immediately now responded hours later with careful, measured words that committed to nothing. For the first time in his life, Richard Walsh was experiencing what it felt like to be kept in the dark. He had built his career on controlling information, controlling people, controlling every variable that mattered. Now the variables were moving without his permission, and he could not even identify who was moving them. I continued my normal routine. I went to my quiet office every morning. I reviewed reports. I made phone calls. I moved chess pieces that no one could see with patience and precision, never rushing, never overreaching. I had waited 15 years for this moment. I could wait a few more weeks to watch it unfold completely. The first public blow came at the end of Megan's second week. Payroll failed. The company's operating account did not have sufficient liquid funds to process salary payments for 3,000 employees. The direct deposits that should have appeared on Friday morning simply did not appear. By Friday afternoon, the phones in Human Resources were ringing constantly. By Friday evening, employees were posting on social media asking if anyone else had experienced the same problem. By Saturday morning, the press was asking questions. Megan held an emergency all-hands meeting on Saturday afternoon. I was not there, but I received a detailed account from 3 different sources. She stood in front of the assembled employees, confused, frightened, angry employees who had not been paid, and promised that everything would be resolved within 48 hours. She spoke with confidence she did not feel, using words she did not fully understand, making commitments she had no idea how to keep. Richard made the decision that would ultimately destroy him that same weekend. To secure an emergency loan from the bank, he mortgaged the family mansion, the same mansion where he had announced Megan's CEO appointment just 2 weeks earlier. The bank approved the loan on Monday morning. Payroll was processed by Monday afternoon. The immediate crisis was resolved. But Richard had just put his most valuable personal asset on the line to save a company he no longer controlled. He did not know this yet. He would learn soon enough. The message was clear to anyone who understood how power actually worked. Titles mean nothing. Authority means nothing. The only thing that matters is money, and the only person who controlled the money was me. 3 days after the payroll crisis was resolved, a team of auditors arrived at Walsh Industries headquarters. They presented credentials from a respected independent firm along with documentation authorizing a comprehensive review of the company's financial records for the past 10 years. They were not there by accident. The auditors arrived on a Tuesday morning, unannounced and unsmiling. There were 7 of them carrying briefcases and laptops presenting credentials from one of the most respected independent accounting firms in the country. They requested access to all financial records from the past 10 years. They requested dedicated office space. They requested cooperation from every department head. They made it clear in polite but unmistakable terms that this was not optional. Megan called me that afternoon. It was the first time she had spoken to me since Christmas, and her voice carried the particular strain of someone who has just realized they are in far more trouble than they understood. "Did you know about this?" she demanded. "Did you know auditors were coming?" I told her I had no idea. It was technically true. I had not known the exact date they would arrive. I had only arranged for them to come. As majority shareholder, I had the legal right to request an independent audit at any time. Corporate governance provisions standard in most shareholder agreements allowed any holder of more than 50% ownership to demand a comprehensive review if they had reasonable concerns about financial management or regulatory compliance. I had those concerns. I had documented those concerns, and I had submitted my request through Edward Chen 6 weeks earlier, timed to arrive shortly after Megan's appointment would maximize chaos and minimize her ability to prepare. The auditors worked methodically, requesting documents in sequences that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for. They started with executive expense reports, moved to vendor payment records, then requested access to accounts that most employees did not even know existed. Within 2 weeks, they had uncovered what I had always suspected but never been able to prove directly: hidden accounts in subsidiary companies that existed only on paper, unauthorized fund transfers moving money between entities with no clear business purpose, tax filings that bore little resemblance to actual financial activity, personal expenses, vacations, vehicles, home renovations, jewelry charged to the company over more than a decade. The amounts were staggering. The patterns were unmistakable. And Megan's signature appeared on dozens of documents authorizing transactions she clearly had never understood. She had signed whatever Richard put in front of her. She had trusted that her father would never put her in legal jeopardy. She had been wrong. The Walsh family had always presented itself as a united front, a dynasty built on shared values and mutual loyalty. That facade crumbled within days of the audit's preliminary findings. I heard about the first major confrontation from Edward, who had been summoned to the family mansion to discuss legal options. Richard and Megan were screaming at each other in the living room when he arrived. Richard blamed Megan for being careless, for signing documents without reading them, for exposing the family to liability through her negligence. Megan blamed the finance department, the accountants, anyone except herself or her father. She accused Richard of setting her up, of using her as a shield for his own activities. Margaret sat in a corner of the room, silent, watching her husband and daughter tear each other apart. She did not intervene. She did not take sides. She simply observed her face, revealing nothing of what she was thinking. The board members who had applauded Megan's appointment just weeks earlier now refused Richard's calls. Old friends who had attended dinner parties at the mansion suddenly had scheduling conflicts that prevented any meetings. The social network that had sustained the Walsh family for decades evaporated almost overnight, as people who had benefited from Richard's connections calculated whether continued association was worth the risk. The press accelerated the collapse. Someone I never learned who leaked information about the audit to a business journalist. The first article was cautious, mentioning only that Walsh Industries was undergoing a comprehensive financial review. The second article, published 3 days later, used phrases like potential irregularities and ongoing investigation. By the end of the month, the headlines included words like fraud and criminal exposure. The share price for the small percentage of Walsh Industries stock that was publicly traded collapsed by 40%. Investors who had held shares for decades sold everything, unwilling to be associated with a company facing this level of scrutiny. The value of Richard's remaining holdings evaporated. The emergency loan he had secured by mortgaging the mansion now represented a debt he had no clear way to repay. It was during this chaos that I sent the letter. I typed it myself on plain paper using a public printer at a copy shop 20 miles from my apartment. 6 words: this isn't revenge, this is restoration. No signature, no return address. I hired a courier service to deliver it directly to Richard at his office with instructions to place it in his hands and no one else's. Edward told me later that Richard sat at his desk for nearly an hour after reading that letter, staring at the paper, not speaking to anyone who entered his office. He understood finally that none of this was coincidence. The payroll crisis, the partner, hesitations, the audit, the press leaks, they were not random misfortunes or market conditions or regulatory accidents. They were coordinated. They were deliberate. They were the work of someone who had been planning for years, someone who knew the company's vulnerabilities intimately, someone who had access to information that should have been impossible to obtain. For the first time in his life, Richard Walsh was afraid. Not of the auditors, not of the press, not even of potential criminal charges. He was afraid because he did not know who his enemy was. He had spent his entire career identifying threats and neutralizing them before they could cause damage. Now he was under attack from someone he could not see, could not find, could not fight. He suspected competitors. He suspected disgruntled former employees. He suspected board members who might have turned against him. He reviewed every relationship, every conflict, every person he had wronged over the decades. He never suspected me. The invisible daughter, the one he had dismissed so completely that she had ceased to exist in his calculations of who might be capable of destroying him. The war was not just financial anymore. It was personal. And Richard was only beginning to understand who he had been fighting against all along. Megan found me 3 weeks after the audit began. I do not know how she obtained the address of my office. Perhaps she hired someone to follow me. Perhaps she pressured Edward. Perhaps she simply searched until she found something. It did not matter. I had been expecting her. She arrived without announcement, pushing past my assistant and throwing open the door to my private office like she still had the right to enter any room she chose. Her appearance shocked me, though I did not let it show. The polished, confident sister, who had accepted the CEO position with rehearsed humility just weeks earlier, was gone. In her place stood a woman with dark circles under her eyes, wrinkled clothing, and the particular desperation of someone who has realized too late that they are drowning. "We need to talk," Megan said, her voice hoarse. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Sit down." She sat. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Megan looked around my office, the modest furniture, the financial reports stacked neatly on my desk, the view of an unremarkable street below, and I could see her trying to reconcile this space with everything she thought she knew about me. This was not the office of the invisible sister, the overlooked daughter, the family disappointment. This was the office of someone who had been planning something significant for a very long time. "I came to make a deal," Megan finally said. "Whatever you want. Money shares a position at the company. We can work something out. We're still sisters." I let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "We were never sisters, Megan. We were two people who happened to share a mother. You made that clear every day of our lives." Her face twisted somewhere between anger and despair. "Fine, you hate me, I understand. But this doesn't have to destroy both of us. Whatever you're doing, we can find a way to—" "Before we discuss anything," I interrupted calmly, "there's something I want to know. How long have you known?" Megan froze. Her eyes widened slightly, and I saw the calculation happening behind them, the rapid assessment of how much to admit, how much to deny, how to position herself for the best possible outcome. It was the same calculation she had made her entire life, the same self-serving arithmetic that had guided every decision she had ever made. 3 years, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've known for 3 years." She told me everything. 3 years ago, she had been leaving a cafe near the financial district when she spotted me through the window, sitting at a corner table, speaking intensely into my phone. Curious Megan was always curious about what I was doing, always looking for information she could use. She had positioned herself close enough to overhear fragments of my conversation. She heard me discussing share acquisitions with someone she assumed was a lawyer. She heard me mention holding companies' ownership percentages, long-term strategies. "I knew you were planning something," Megan said. "I knew you were buying shares, building towards something. I just didn't know how far along you were." "And you didn't tell Father," I said. It was not a question. "No." She looked down at her hands. "I thought about it, but then I realized if you failed, I would still be the only heir. Father would never give you anything anyway, and if you succeeded—" She paused, swallowing hard. "If you succeeded, we're still family. I figured you would need allies. I figured I could position myself to benefit either way." There it was, the pure distilled essence of who my sister had always been. She had known about my plan for 3 years and said nothing, not out of loyalty, not out of sisterly solidarity, but out of calculated self-interest. She had bet on both horses, confident that no matter which one won, she would find a way to claim the prize. "I see," I said. "So you decided to play both sides." "I was protecting myself," Megan insisted. "You would have done the same thing." "No," I replied. "I wouldn't have, but that's not the point." I leaned forward slightly, holding her gaze. "The point is that you heard exactly what I wanted you to hear. I arranged that phone call, Megan. I knew you would be at that cafe. I knew you would spy on me. I made sure you overheard just enough to think you understood my plan, and just enough to make you believe that staying silent was your best option." The color drained from her face. "What? 3 years ago, I needed you to do nothing. I needed you to feel confident that you had leverage, that you knew my secrets, that you could use that information whenever it became necessary. Your silence gave me the time I needed to complete my acquisitions without interference. Your arrogance made you predictable." Megan stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "You manipulated me." "I gave you an opportunity to do the right thing," I corrected. "You chose to do what you always do, whatever you thought would benefit you most. The manipulation was your own." I explained what would happen next. Her appointment as CEO had never been legally valid because she was never approved by the controlling shareholder, me. The contracts she had signed during her brief tenure were under review, and many would likely be voided. The documents she had endorsed without reading during the years before her appointment connected her directly to financial irregularities that were now the subject of a formal investigation. Even if she had signed them unknowingly, her signature made her liable. "I'm not offering you a deal," I said. "I'm not offering you a partnership or a position or protection. I'm telling you facts so that you can make informed decisions about your own future." Megan stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward. "You can't do this. Father will do nothing," I interrupted. "Father does not control this company anymore. I do." She left my office without another word, slamming the door behind her. I sat quietly for a long time after she was gone, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, only the cold clarity of a plan proceeding exactly as designed. Megan had spent her entire life underestimating me. She had dismissed me as irrelevant, as harmless as someone not worth worrying about. That dismissal had made her blind to what I was building, deaf to the warnings she should have heeded, and ultimately complicit in her own destruction. She was not promoted to CEO because she deserved it. She was positioned as a scapegoat for crimes she did not fully understand. And she had walked into that role willingly, eagerly, without ever questioning why the crown was being handed to her so easily. I chose a Monday morning. There was no particular strategic reason for this. The legal work was complete. The board had been notified, the documents were ready. But something about starting a new chapter at the beginning of a week felt appropriate. 15 years of planning deserved a clean beginning. I dressed carefully that morning, selecting clothes that conveyed authority without ostentation. A dark suit, well-tailored but not flashy, simple jewelry, minimal makeup. I wanted to look like someone who had earned her position through competence, not someone who needed external validation to feel powerful. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman I barely recognized, not because I had changed, but because I was finally allowing myself to be seen. The drive to Walsh Industries headquarters took 20 minutes. I had made this drive hundreds of times over the years, always arriving early, always parking in the back lot, always entering through the side door that employees used to avoid the executive entrance. Today, I drove to the main entrance and handed my keys to the valet, who had never once acknowledged my existence in 15 years of employment. "Good morning, Ms. Walsh," he said. He knew. Somehow he already knew. I walked through the front doors of the building I had helped save dozens of times, the building where my strategies had been presented under other people's names, the building where I had been systematically erased from every success I created. The lobby was full of employees arriving for their morning shifts, checking phones, carrying coffee, moving through the routines that defined their days. And then something extraordinary happened. People stopped. One by one, employees noticed me walking through the lobby, not toward the side elevator I always used, but straight toward the executive elevator bank at the center of the building. A young woman from the operations department, someone I had mentored informally for years, was the first to stand. She simply rose from the bench where she had been sitting, her face showing no surprise, only recognition. Others followed. A manager from finance who had watched me solve problems his superiors could not understand. An engineer who had come to me quietly years ago when her ideas were being stolen by her supervisor. A security guard who had always held the side door open for me with a knowing nod. They stood as I passed, not in surprise, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement of something they had known long before this moment. The informal networks of any company carry information that never appears in official communications. The workers who actually ran daily operations, who fixed problems at midnight, who covered for incompetent executives who kept projects alive through sheer determination, had always known who really solved the difficult questions. They had watched me work for 15 years. They had seen my ideas, appropriated my contributions, erased my presence, diminished. And they had been waiting. I nodded to them as I walked, acknowledging their acknowledgement, feeling something I had not expected: gratitude. Not for their loyalty to me personally, but for their recognition that competence mattered, that truth mattered, that the people who did the real work deserved to be seen. The executive elevator required a key card. Mine had been deactivated years ago, restricted to lower floors only, but Edward Chen was waiting for me at the elevator bank, and he handed me a new card without a word. It opened every door in the building. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock. I arrived at 8:45, entering the executive conference room before anyone else. I chose a seat at the head of the table, the seat where Richard Walsh had presided over this company for 3 decades. I set my documents in front of me and waited. Board members arrived in small groups, their faces carrying varying degrees of anxiety, resignation, and careful neutrality. Several had been contacted by Edward in previous weeks, informed quietly of the ownership situation, given time to adjust their expectations. They knew what was coming. They had made their calculations. Richard arrived last, accompanied by Megan. They entered the conference room together, and for a moment both of them froze when they saw me sitting in the chairman's seat. Megan's face went pale. Richard's expression shifted through several emotions I could not quite identify before settling into something like stone. "Please sit down," I said. My voice was calm, professional, carrying no trace of triumph or vindictiveness. "We have business to conduct." The proceedings took less than 20 minutes. I presented documentation of my ownership, 60% of Walsh Industries shares, held through my intermediary company, acquired legally over 15 years, fully verified by independent counsel. Edward confirmed the authenticity of every document. The board members reviewed the paperwork, asked a few procedural questions, and then voted. Unanimous recognition of my position as controlling shareholder. Unanimous appointment as interim CEO. Unanimous rescission of Megan Walsh's prior appointment, which had never been valid without majority shareholder approval. 15 years of planning executed in a single morning. Throughout the entire meeting, Richard did not speak. He sat in a chair along the side of the table, not at the head, not in a position of authority, just another attendee in a meeting he no longer controlled. The man who had commanded this company for 30 years, who had made decisions that affected thousands of lives, who had looked at me with cold dismissal for my entire existence, now had no vote, no voice, no power. When I formally took my seat as CEO, I looked at him directly. He could not meet my eyes. Not from shame. Richard Walsh had never experienced shame in his life. From something worse, the absolute inability to accept that the daughter he had dismissed, diminished, and erased was now his superior in every way that mattered. His mind simply could not process the reality in front of him. The meeting concluded. Board members filed out quietly, some nodding to me, others avoiding eye contact, all of them recalculating their positions in the new order. Megan left quickly, nearly running from the room, unwilling to witness another moment of her family's collapse. Richard was the last to leave. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements carrying the weight of a man who had aged decades in a single hour. He walked toward the door without looking at me, without speaking, without acknowledging that anything significant had occurred. No one moved to help him. No one acknowledged his departure. The man who had demanded deference for 30 years walked out of that boardroom alone, diminished and visible. I sat in silence after everyone had gone, looking around the room, where so many decisions had been made without me, where so many of my contributions had been credited to others, where my existence had been treated as an inconvenience rather than an asset. I did not feel joy. I did not feel triumph. I felt only the quiet satisfaction of a long project finally completed. I had not taken the chair back. I had replaced it entirely, and everyone who had ever sat in it. The final meeting happened 2 weeks after the board confirmed my position. Richard had requested it through Edward, using language that suggested he wanted to negotiate some kind of settlement. I knew there was nothing left to negotiate, but I agreed anyway. Some endings need to happen face to face. The Walsh mansion looked different with the for sale sign planted in the front lawn. The bank had moved quickly, once it became clear that Richard could not repay the emergency loan he had secured by mortgaging the property. The house where I had spent so many holidays sitting in corner chairs being overlooked and dismissed would soon belong to strangers. I felt nothing about this. It had never been my home. Richard, Margaret, and Megan were waiting in the living room when I arrived. The space that had once hosted elaborate parties and carefully staged family photographs now felt hollow, emptied of the illusions that had sustained it for decades. Megan sat on the couch, her eyes red from crying. Richard stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid with fury. He was barely containing. "You destroyed this family," he said as soon as I entered. His voice was bitter, cracking with an anger that had nowhere productive to go. "Everything I built, everything I worked for, you tore it apart out of spite." I did not respond. There was nothing I could say that would change his understanding of what had happened, and I had no interest in defending myself to a man whose opinion had ceased to matter to me years ago. "Are you satisfied?" Richard continued. "Is this what you wanted, to see us ruined?" Before I could answer, Margaret stood up from her chair. She had been silent since I arrived, watching the confrontation with an expression I could not read. Now she stepped forward, positioning herself between Richard and me, and when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity I had never heard from her before. "I didn't betray this family," Margaret said, looking directly at her husband. "I saved the only child who deserved saving." The room went absolutely still. Richard's face drained of color. Megan stopped crying, staring at her mother with confusion that slowly transformed into horror. Margaret turned to face all of us, and then she told the truth. 15 years ago, she had approached me secretly because she knew Richard would never give his non-biological daughter anything. The share transfer was only the beginning. Over the years that followed, Margaret had fed me information I could never have obtained on my own board meeting agendas, Richard's strategic plans, Megan's movements, and vulnerabilities. She had been my source inside the family, passing intelligence through methods we had established during that first meeting at the distant cafe. "The letters," I said quietly. "The birthday letters." Margaret nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I see you. Keep going." Every year on my birthday, I had received an anonymous letter with those 5 words. No signature, no return address, just that simple message that had sustained me through some of the darkest moments of my planning. I had never known who sent them. I had assumed it was someone at the company who had noticed my work, someone who wanted me to know that my efforts were not entirely invisible. It had been my mother. All along, it had been my mother. "Every harsh word I said to you in front of him," Margaret continued, her voice breaking, "every time I ignored you at family gatherings, every moment I treated you like you didn't matter, it was cover. If Richard suspected I was helping you, everything would have collapsed. I had to make him believe I had abandoned you completely." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "It broke my heart. Every single day it broke my heart." Richard stared at his wife as if seeing a stranger. The woman he had controlled and dismissed for 30 years, the woman he had assumed was too weak and compliant to challenge him, had been working against him the entire time. His marriage, like his company, had been an illusion he never thought to question. Megan looked between her parents with an expression of dawning understanding. Her mother had not loved Lindsay less, she had simply loved her differently, in the only way that circumstances allowed. The favoritism Megan had enjoyed her entire life was not evidence of greater love. It was evidence of easier love, love that could be expressed publicly without risk. I looked at my mother. For the first time in 15 years, we could acknowledge each other without pretense. Her eyes were wet, mine were dry. But I nodded, and that nod contained everything I could not say aloud: gratitude, understanding, and the closure of a wound that had been open for 30 years. The family did not fall apart that day. It simply stopped pretending it had ever been whole. 1 year later, I sat in my corner office on the 42nd floor watching the sun set over a city that had once seemed so indifferent to my existence. The view was magnificent, a reward I had never sought but had certainly earned. Below me, the streets moved with their usual rhythm, filled with people living their own stories, fighting their own battles, building their own futures. I wondered sometimes how many of them were invisible in their own families, overlooked in their own companies, waiting for their moment to step into the light. The consequences of that Christmas dinner had fully materialized by then. Richard Walsh lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, surviving on a modest pension from retirement accounts I had chosen not to touch. Not out of mercy, I felt no obligation to show mercy to a man who had shown me none. Out of indifference, he simply was not worth the effort of complete destruction. His social standing had evaporated entirely. The friends who had attended his parties and praised his leadership had disappeared the moment his power vanished. No one returned his calls. No one invited him to dinners. The man who had commanded respect for decades now commanded nothing but the silence of an empty apartment. Megan had moved across the country, taking a position at a small consulting firm where no one knew she had once been announced as CEO of a major corporation. Her credit cards had been declined too many times to count during the months after the collapse. The lifestyle she had enjoyed her entire life, the vacations, the designer clothes, the assumption that money would always be available, had disappeared overnight. I heard through occasional reports that she was rebuilding, slowly learning for the first time what it meant to earn something rather than receive it. Perhaps that experience would make her a better person. Perhaps not. I no longer cared enough to find out. The name Walsh was no longer associated with power and prestige. It was associated with scandal fraud and spectacular downfall. The family that had erased me from their history had been erased from relevance. Walsh Industries had been renamed Walsh Lindsay Group 6 months after I took control. Under my leadership, the company did not merely recover from its crisis. It tripled in growth within 12 months. I kept every employee who had been loyal during the dark years, the ones who had stood in that lobby as I walked through the ones who had known the truth long before it became public. I personally promoted those who had helped me quietly, recognizing their contributions in ways that my predecessors never had. The company culture transformed completely: merit over politics, transparency over favoritism, competence over connections. A business magazine put me on their cover with the headline, "The Daughter Who Bought Her Freedom." In the interview, they asked me about my family, about the collapse, about what I wanted people to understand from my story. I gave them only one quote worth remembering: "I built what I deserved. Everyone gets what they deserve eventually." It was the most devastating statement I could have made, and I made it with a smile. Margaret divorced Richard quietly without drama or prolonged legal battles. She moved into a modest house not far from my apartment, a space she decorated herself for the first time in her life. We had coffee together every Sunday morning, a ritual that would have been impossible during the years of secrecy, and one that we both treasured now. Our relationship was not immediately warm. Too many years of necessary distance had taken their toll. But we were building something new, something honest, something that did not require performance or protection. On my 38th birthday, Margaret gave me a box. Inside were photographs she had secretly kept for decades. My college graduation, my first day at Walsh Industries, moments of achievement she had witnessed from afar, but could never celebrate publicly. She had been there watching, documenting, preserving evidence of a daughter the rest of the family had tried to erase. I looked through those photographs, slowly seeing my own history through my mother's hidden eyes. I still did not cry. But when I hugged her, it was the first genuine embrace we had shared since I was a child, and it lasted longer than either of us expected. I never married. I never felt the need. The validation I had once craved from others, from my father, from my family, from a world that seemed determined to overlook me, no longer held any power over my choices. I had built my empire from the ashes of rejection, transformed pain into power silence, into strategy abandonment, into independence. The girl who had been erased from her family's history had written her own story. They gave me nothing. So I built everything. And in the end, that was the only inheritance I ever needed. If Lindsay's story moved you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who later regretted it? Or maybe you are still waiting for your moment to prove them wrong. Either way, your story matters, and I want to hear it. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. Every week, I bring you powerful tales of resilience, revenge, and redemption that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And remember Lindsay's words, everyone gets what they deserve eventually. Sometimes karma takes 15 years. Sometimes it takes longer, but it always arrives. Thank you for watching until the end. I will see you in the next story.